Hi, this is The Philosophical Angle, and I'm your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books of philosophy, one of which is The Philosophical Equations of Economics. These books are available free for viewing online at www.philosophypublishing.com. Along with me is my panelist and discussant, Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale, has an MBA from Wharton, an MA from Tufts. He's in the venture capital business and retired from the investment banking business. Good to see you, Rick.
Good to see you.
The purpose of the philosophical angle is to discuss and examine the nature of concepts being used in current media and compare the essence of the concept within the circumstances and usage in which they're being used. This week, we're asking, why is the ObamaCare website so expensive? It came to my notice that in the last week, a private company sent a spaceship to Mars, and its cost was $72 million. A website to show an insurance product or products by the government so far has cost almost $700 million? Which would be more difficult to do? $72 million for a trip to Mars, $680 for a website. I don't know. I'm not an expert in either one, but my gut feeling tells me that the trip to Mars is more difficult. So why the inefficiency of the government to put up such an expense and not have it work? There must be some fundamental reason why this is possible. Let's explore. First, in analyzing the difference between a governmental situation and a corporate situation, let's look at the components. First, with a government, you've got the voters and the constituents. And commensurate with that, on the corporate side, you have the shareholders who invest capital. And they formulate the articles of an incorporation. They incorporate and form a corporation, and the voters and constituents a long time ago constructed a constitution. These are equivalent. Rules by how the entity shall behave. So the corporation is equivalent to the government. The government has its representatives elected from the constituents. The shareholders have elected the officers who hire employees. And the representatives, they do the same. They've got their employees of the government who put out the product or products of the government. Same with the corporation. The employees produce the product and services of the government. And so what are of the corporation? So that can be varied, as you well know, but the products of the government, what are they? Well, they're things like the post office, like national defense, the judicial system, the entitlement system, taking money from one section of their constituents and placing it in the hands of another, and then making all the types of departments, the FDA, the educational, commerce, and all the departments that they have to oversee what's going on in the private sector. But the interesting fact is that the government operates with no profit, and thus there is no motivation. Whereas the individual side, products and services are produced by the employees hired by the corporation to produce a profit. And there are 2 types of profit. There's corporate profit, where the corporation is formed to make a profit, to produce goods and services, to make a profit. And there's individual profit. They're essentially the same. There's no difference. The individual goes to work for a corporation, takes home his pay, buys some food, relaxes on Sunday on the front porch. And relaxing on Sunday on the front porch, that leisure is profit. His ability to not have to work that day is profit. Just as the corporation saves its profit to either reinvest or to give it to its shareholders back so that they may sit on their front porch on Sunday afternoon and relax. The profit to gather profit comes from the incentive to bring ourselves up away from misery. In other words, to enjoy life. And so, bringing us up away from misery that's provided by the profit from the incentive is good, because we want to be able to eat nice food and have a nice life and enjoy ourselves on Sunday afternoon. And so now we have to ask, well, what is incentive? Where does that concept come from? Well, that's a decisional priority. And priorities are pieces of knowledge that we create in our mind from the information, from the stimulus that comes from not only within ourselves, but from out. And it produces desires. In other words, we prioritize our actions to attain things and to fulfill the desire that brings us up away from misery is the basis of all of incentive, which is good. So our attainment, our look to attain, our desire to attain goodness for ourselves is the incentive by which we go after profit, which will bring ourselves up away from misery. But this end game here is lacking on the governmental side. And so when there's no motivation, inefficiency, one of the byproducts of that is inefficiency. We just don't care as much because it's not trying to bring ourselves up away from misery. And thus, it's not trying to attain goodness. And that's a remarkable conclusion. The government doesn't actually try to attain goodness. Government knows no good and no bad. It is amoral, aethical. Now, how do I know this? I mean, how could you say such a thing, Chris? That the government doesn't try to do good? Well, certainly it sure does. I know that we have all these transfer patients, we have all this welfare, and we're trying to help people out. Isn't that done by the government? It is. But on the other side, it doesn't place that as good or bad. Because on the other side of maybe doing welfare for people that need it, there are other examples on the opposite side where the government doesn't try to do good. Let me give you an example. The Wall Street editorial on November 5th, 2013, in the Review and Outlook column, entitled "A Federalism Watershed." In Bond versus U.S., the Supreme Court will decide if a treaty trumps state police powers. Now I'm going to read you the first few paragraphs of this editorial to show you my point here. The Supreme Court hears its most consequential case so far this term on Tuesday, and the question boils down to this: can the federal government use a treaty with foreign nations to vitiate police powers that the Constitution reserves for the 50 states? That may seem esoteric, but the question goes to the heart of the Constitution's separation of powers. That doctrine limits the writ of Congress by reserving certain powers to the states and the people. The last century has seen Washington wrest ever more power from the states. But even in this misguided Obamacare opinion last year, Chief Justice John Roberts recognized limits on the reach of the Commerce Clause. Here's another opportunity, this time concerning the treaty power. In Bond versus U.S., Carol Bond of Lansdale, Pennsylvania, concedes that she spread a toxic chemical she had obtained from her employer on the car and mailbox of a friend who had an affair with her husband. The chemical did minimal harm, despite her clear intent to do so. But federal prosecutors intervened in what would normally be a state criminal case to charge Mrs. Bond with violating the Chemical Weapons Convention that the Senate ratified in 1997. Yes, you heard that right. Mrs. Bond was convicted of waging chemical warfare, unlike Syria's Bashar Assad, who has been charged with nothing. The treaty may not get its man overseas, but it did get Mrs. Bond. Obviously, the government knows no goodness here. Why would the federal government step in and try to punish a menial criminal case such as this? They don't have goodness here, but they're doing what they think is best in the prosecution of its laws. In other words, it's a goodness. And there are many examples like this that are done throughout regulations by the federal government, from the EPA to the FDA to constant battles coming down on the regular people of the United States. Here's an example. And this is why they can do so, because they do not seek goodness. They don't seek badness either. They're amoral. Okay, I've spoken enough for now. Let's go to Rick and see what he's got to say about the inefficiency of government, and particularly the cost of this website of Obamacare. Rick, any comments to open up the arguments here?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with any of those comments. I would add that, and I'm not the only one to make this observation, that the inherent nature of the procurement process in government often leads to absurd results and very inefficient allocation of resources. And I saw this years ago when I was working with a nonprofit. And it goes along these lines. There are so many rules affecting how a government agency procures goods and services, whether it's a requirement that they buy from minority providers of those services, whether it's a requirement that they not concentrate all of their contracts with one or two providers, whether it's influence from a particular political organization or lobbying organization or state or locality that a provider located or associated with that particular entity be given an opportunity to provide services. There are so many and often irrational actors that affect the procurement process that it's very, very rare for the government to be able to conduct the kind of direct and efficient procurement procedure that a normal corporation would, which is unconstrained by all of these influences. And so, in that light, it's not surprising to me at all that the website has been delayed. It wasn't tested properly. I think that the real killer for the website is going to be security breaches, frankly, and I think the worst of that is yet to be seen. So I don't think anyone with any significant assets will risk using the website for a long time to come until it's absolutely proven to be secure. But all that said, you see this, and this is not new news. It's been common throughout the history of the U.S. government and other governments that the irrational procurement process leads to these substandard results.
Well, you say procurement process. What do you mean by that? Is this the
purchasing of goods or services for the benefit of a government agency or directive?
And so this is the same process being used by corporations. In other words, they have to go out and gather parts for, like a car for General Motors would have to be built on an assembly line, and many parts are outsourced. And so the corporation has to go out and purchase these components and able to produce their product. That's the procurement process that you're speaking of?
Yes, but in the case of a corporation, they aren't subject to significant lobbying. They aren't under pressure to provide, to offer those procurement contracts to entities from a particular state. There may be minor influences, but at the end of the day, a corporation has to be disciplined by the profit motive. Government is not.
Okay, that's right. I agree. The government seems to have to is not motivated by profit. So what happens inside that procurement process in the government that corrupts it so badly that it goes from, and let's say that there is an equivalency here between a trip to Mars, just for the sake of argument, a trip to Mars and building a complicated website. I don't think so, but let's argue that it's equivalent. So it was approximately 10 times the amount for the website. What could possibly seep into the procurement process whereby tenfold it becomes corrupted?
Well, it starts with the budget allocation process, because normally within government it's backwards. In other words, a certain amount of money is allocated to a project, call it the website, and let's say that amount is roughly $300 million. Within government agencies, their focus is on finding a way to spend the entire budget, if not more. There's very little incentive to come in under budget.
Okay, but
because the amount spent on anything either directly or indirectly impacts profit, there's always an incentive to implement on the most efficient basis possible. I mean, it doesn't always happen. There are exceptions. There are badly run corporations. But that is generally the dynamic.
Okay. So what are some of the priorities, or what are some of the influences that seep into the government process? Obviously, we've already mentioned that there's no profit motive. Okay, so that means some inefficiencies, but tenfold? Is the profit motive responsible for a tenfold, even more, in actuality it's probably even more, corruption of the process, making it so much more expensive for the government to produce its products?
Sadly, that's entirely possible. And in this case, it seems probable. Sure, because particularly the more cooks you get in the kitchen, and there were many contractors involved in building the website, the more costs tend to overlap, run over budget. There's overlapping projects being done. There's waste. So that dynamic alone, involving so many contractors, tends to, increase these problems.
Okay, well, I think probably we've hit upon a salient point that in addition to the profit motive, the lack of profit motive in the government side, you have several and sundry further priorities that are putting its nose into the process. And probably some of them come from the very representatives that the government brings in and to monitor the process. And for everyone, he'll have his constituencies. The representatives have constituencies throughout in their area of the government, or their area of the nation, and may therefore bring different priorities to whatever process they look to oversee. Is that a possibility? Is that maybe what's further exacerbating the procurement process here?
I'm virtually certain that's the case. Of course, the government's been very secretive up to this point as to where the problems are and how many end users are being served and how many persons have actually been able to sign up, and it's all remained murky. But ultimately, this sort of thing will come to light. There'll be more congressional hearings, more information will spill out, and we'll find out, I'm quite certain, that favors were being done, more contractors were involved than were necessary or efficient, substandard contractors were involved that never should have been involved because of calls made by representatives from various states and so forth. All of this will come to light, or at least a certain portion of it.
Okay. So we've got this several priorities, no lack of profit, or no lack of profit motive in the kitchen of the procurement process in the government kitchen, where they're whipping up this product called the ObamaCare website. So if this process is so inefficient here, then the same must be true of all the other things the government are producing. Does this inefficiency run all throughout government, Rick? What do you think?
Generally, yes. I think depending on specific managers, it will be less or more. It's pretty obvious that Ms. Sebelius is an extremely incompetent manager, so I think this is a particularly severe case. Not all the agencies of the government are run this badly, or by persons with so little experience in the details of building what is essentially an IT product, right? But to a greater or lesser degree, it's common throughout, and stories like this appear periodically and have done so for generations.
Well, if we take a look at Mars versus website, it's basically a 90% inefficiency rate.
So it seems.
And it's probably actually even worse because I'm sure a trip to Mars is more complicated than a website. So let's say it's 99%. Could all of government be really 99% inefficient? I hope not.
Well, that's probably the worst case scenario, but I think broadly speaking, it is less efficient than the private sector.
Now there's an understatement. Thank you very much. Well, what can we do about it in the future? How can this process be rectified? What can we do? Is there anything?
I think everything that has been tried, that could be tried, has been tried in terms of reining in how the government operates. The problem is much more fundamental. And so the only answer really is to pursue a limited government with very specific enumerated powers that are known to function better than others. And for everything else, you let the private sector work its magic.
Okay. So really the solution is to outsource to the private sector as much as possible the government's needs. Do I read that conclusion correctly?
Yes.
Okay. But wasn't this one also outsourced? Wasn't the website also outsourced? So if it hadn't been outsourced, it'd have been okay, even worse. But it was outsourced, so it's still at a 90% inefficiency rate. Anything further to do?
Well, yes, but I think the more fundamental argument is, should we have bothered to institute the Affordable Care Act in the first place? And if without that, then none of this would have occurred.
Well, good point. And there you have it, the final conclusion. I think possibly the inefficiency rate can be helped reduced by lessening the need for the government to go out and lessening the need for the government products, and let products be done by the individual. Rick, I want to thank you for joining us. As always, you're on the Philosophical Angle, and I want to thank all my viewers, and see you next week on the Philosophical Angle. Thanks very much.